In this course, you'll learn everything you need to know to start manipulating the DOM with JavaScript. DOM stands for Document Object Model, and in this beginner's course, you'll learn how to use JavaScript to dynamically change the content, the structure, and the styling of a web page. We're going to be using this HTML file. It's a very simple file, and we're specifically going to be looking at this element in particular. It's a div element with the ID of playground and magic of the DOM. The document object model represents the structure of a document as like a tree-like hierarchy of objects. So the div comes inside of the body, or it's like almost like a branch, or it's really a child element of the body. And each HTML element becomes an object in the DOM, which we can manipulate using JavaScript. So let's go over to the JavaScript, and we're going to talk about how to get elements from the DOM and to add elements to the DOM or to the page. So we're going to select our playground area. We have document.getElementById playground. So this is just going to get reference to this particular element because it has ID of playground, and we're going to get element by ID playground. Get element by ID returns a single element or null if no matching element is found. Now we can use append to add content. So playground.append, and then I can put what I want to append here. And we're just going to append the word wizard. So if I save that, we can see that it's automatically going to update. I have it set up so whenever I save my file, it's going to update in the browser here. So magic of the DOM, wizard, it appended that to the DOM. And we can look at what the HTML looks like. If I open up the developer tools, we can see it says magic of the DOM, and then it shows wizard. Because of the emoji, it kind of looks kind of funny here, but you can see it appended that to the DOM. Now, there's a few other ways to get a document element. So get element by ID is a very popular way. There's also query selector. Query selector, you can then within these parentheses or within these quotation marks, you can put any CSS selector. So if we're going to get an ID, it's going to be the pound sign or the hash mark playground. And this is going to do the exact same thing. It's going to get the same element because we're getting the element with the ID of playground. If we had a class, then we can do a dot here if we wanted to get the element with a class of playground, or we could just do div if we want to get the first div. So if I save that, it's also going to just show the same thing because it's getting the exact same element. So query selector is going to return the first element that matches a CSS selector. Or you can do query selector all to match all elements. Now if we save this, it's not going to look the same anymore because this is now a list of elements and we can't just append to a list of elements. But let's go back to get element by ID. So that's a pretty standard way of doing it if you know the ID, or query selector if you want to get an element that matches any CSS selector. Now go back to talking about append here. Append can also add multiple items at once and can handle both strings and node objects. So if we append multiple objects, here's going to append wizard, then a space, then crystal ball, then a space, then spellbook. So if I save that, we can see wizard, crystal ball, spellbook, and it appended all to the DOM. In a second, I'll talk about appending node objects. Now, a different way of appending things is append child. If I just save this, we're going to get an error. If I go into the console, we'll see an error for when I try to do append child, because append child is an older method that's more limited and you can only append nodes. You cannot append strings. So for the most part, you just want to use append and not append child. So now let's create an actual element. So magical orb is going to equal document.createElement div. We're creating a new div. Right now it's not attached to anything. Then we're setting the text content of the div to be this crystal ball here, or this magic orb. And then we're doing playground. We already have access to the playground element on our page. Playground.append magic orb. So if I save that, we'll see the magic orb here. And then if we look at the HTML here, we can see in the playground we have this magic orb. We could also do, because we're now appending an element instead of a string, we could do append child, and it's going to do the exact same thing. But we're just going to go back to append for now. This technique of creating elements and adding them to the DOM is fundamental in dynamic web applications. It allows you to create new content on the fly based on interactions or data from a server. Now let's talk more about modifying text content. We already briefly touched on it earlier, but there are two main properties for modifying text content. There's inner text and text content. So here we're using .inner text. So basically, first we're creating an element, a paragraph element, then we're appending that element to the playground. Now we're getting access to the element and doing .inner text is setting the inner text to ancient wisdom lies within. And then we can log that inner text. So if we look at the HTML here, we can see there's a paragraph element that says ancient wisdom lies within. And the console, it says ancient wisdom lies within. We can also do the same thing with text content. If I save that, it's going to look very similar. It still says ancient text lies within. It just logs ancient text lies within, or ancient wisdom lies within. So at first glance, it looks like text content and inner text are pretty similar, but there's actually some key differences. So text content is similar to inner text, but it returns the text content of all elements, including script and style elements, and it's not aware of styling, so it will return the content of hidden elements. So to help better understand the difference between text content and inner text, I've updated the index.html with these two paragraphs. One of them is visible secrets. It just says visible secrets. The other one has display style, or style of display none, and it says invisible enigmas. We can see visible secrets on the page here, but it does not say invisible enigmas. And if we look in the HTML here, we can see the invisible enigmas here. Now if I go to the script, I'm now console.logging playground.innerText and playground.text content. So let's go to the console, and we can see when I log inner text, we just see visible secrets. But if I log the text content, we can see the visible secrets and the invisible enigmas. So inner text only shows the visible text, while text content shows all text, including the hidden paragraph. This is because inner text is aware of the rendered appearance of text, while text content simply concatenates the text of all descendant nodes. Understanding these differences is important when working with text content in the DOM. Use inner text when you want to get or set text as it would be visibly rendered, and use text content when you need all text content regardless of styling. Now let's talk about working with HTML content. I changed my HTML file back to Magic of the DOM, and let's look at the JavaScript. Sometimes you might want to add HTML content directly to an element. So for this, we use inner HTML, the inner HTML property. The property is powerful, but should be used with caution due to security considerations. So we're creating a new div, and then we're gonna do spellbook.inner.html is this whole string with HTML, and then we're doing playground.append spellbook. So if I save that, it's now going to say Magic of the DOM, and then we're going to append this spellbook here, which you can see includes the HTML. So if we go into the HTML down here and we look into this paragraph, we can see it's including the strong tags, the im tags, and so all this HTML within the string has been added as HTML. And it will also replace HTML. Like for instance, if I take this off and take this off and then do playground.inner.html, it's now replacing the original HTML. Like the original HTML is magic of the DOM. But now we've replaced the inner HTML with this whole thing. So now it says spells include levitation and invisibility. Now let's quickly compare text content and inner HTML. So we're going to log playground.textContent, then allow playground.inner HTML. If I save that, we go to the console, we can see first the text content is just spells include levitation and invisibility. But when it logs the HTML, it's actually the full HTML with the paragraph tags and the other tags. But like I said, there's security implications when using inner HTML. When you use inner HTML with any content that could potentially come from users or other untrusted sources, you open your application to potential cross-site scripting attacks. So you should always sanitize any user input before inserting it into the DOM, whether you're using inner HTML or other methods. So look at this example. So I just saved it and now it's going to say hacked right here because the user input is this string right here, which happens to have this on-air alert hacked. And then when we add the user input to the inner HTML, it's going to basically run arbitrary JavaScript code, which you don't really want to be having done on your website. So to mitigate this risk, you can use safer alternatives like text content for text-only content, or create elements and append them individually for more complex structures. Removing elements is just as important as adding them in dynamic web applications. So let's look at how to do that. First, we're adding this element. We're creating a p element with the text content now you see me, and then we're appending it to the playground. So you can see we have this paragraph element appended. So let's see how to remove it. It's pretty simple. We just do temporary element dot remove. And we save that, and we can see we don't see the element. It's been removed. We used to see it, now we don't. So it's pretty straightforward. Alternatively, we can use remove child. That would go like this: playground.remove child, and then we're going to pass in temporary element. And if I save that, it's going to look exactly the same. The child element has been removed. So the remove child method is called on the parent element and removes the specified child element. This method requires you to know the parent of the element you want to remove. So both elements effectively remove the element from the DOM, but they have slightly different use cases. So use remove when you have a reference to the element you want to remove and don't need to worry about its parent. And use remove child when you're working with a parent element and want to remove one of its children. This can be useful in loops and when you're managing a list of elements. Let's look at an example of when you would want to use remove child in a loop. So we created a div and called fruit basket. We added these 3 paragraphs and we appended it to the playground. We can see apple, banana, cherry, and then we can see in our HTML apple, banana, cherry. So now I'm going to use a loop here while first basket dot first child. So this would be useful if we didn't really know how many paragraphs there were. Maybe it could be different depending on the page, depending on what's from the database, depending on the user content. While there is a child, that means while this div has something underneath it, which is the child, any element within the div is a child, while there is a first child, then fruit basket dot remove child, fruit basket dot first child. So it's going to keep removing the first element underneath the div that's a child of that div until there's no more children in the divs. So I just save that, and now that list is completely gone. It's not even on here anymore. It's just an empty div. Remember, when you remove an element from the DOM, it's no longer visible or accessible on the page, but it still exists in memory if you have a JavaScript reference to it. This means that you can reinsert it later if you need it. Understanding how to remove elements is really important for creating dynamic web pages where content needs to be updated or removed based on user actions or other events. Let's talk about working with attributes. Attributes provide additional information about HTML elements. They're a fundamental part of HTML and are often used to configure elements or store custom data. Let's explore how to work with common attributes like ID and class. So we could have created this whole thing right in the HTML file, but let's see how to create it in the JavaScript. We're creating a div. We're going to set the ID of the div to wand1. We're going to set the class of the div to magical item and wand, and then the text content, and then appended. Let's see what the rendered HTML looks like. So if you look right here, div, ID wand1, the class, magical item, and wand, and then we have that says magic wand inside here. The set attribute method takes two arguments: the name of the attribute and its value. Now we can also get these attributes. So let's do magic wand dot get attribute, and then we just pass in the name of the attribute. Let's do the ID. We can console.log that, so we can just console.log the attribute. So if I save this, we can go over to the console, and let's just refresh here, so we can see wand1. So now you can get the ID whether it was created in the JavaScript file or if it's created in the HTML file. Like for instance, I could also do playground. So let's look at the playground ID. The ID of playground is playground. So let's go back to the magic wand, and we can also get the attribute of the class. So if I do class, save that, magical item, and wand. Now there's another way to get the attributes. Instead of get attribute ID, we can just do magic wand.id. We can basically get it with the direct property. So if I save that, wand1, and then I can also get the class. But instead of typing class, I have to type in class name. Magical item wand is the class name. So there's basically just two ways of doing it. You can do get attribute ID, or you can just do .id. And the same thing with all the properties here. We can also set the properties that way. So I can say magic wand.id equals wand3, and then we can console.log the ID again. If I save that, we can see it says wand1 and then wand3 after we set the ID. So we can set the attribute like this, or we can set the attribute like this. In general, using the direct property access when available is more idiomatic in JavaScript, but the get attribute, set attribute can be useful for working with custom attributes or when you need to handle attributes in a generic way. Understanding how to work with attributes is really important for many aspects of web development, from styling elements with CSS classes to storing custom data on elements for later use in your JavaScript code. Now let's talk about working with data attributes. Data attributes are a special kind of attribute that allows us to store extra information on standard HTML elements. They're basically a way to embed custom data in your HTML that can be easily accessed via JavaScript. Data attributes always start with data dash. So before we look at this code, let's look at what it looks like in the rendered HTML. So we have a div with an ID of secret scroll, the data spell invisibility data component, moonlight, shadow, essence. So basically we create the div, that's the div. We create the ID, the secret scroll, that's the secret scroll. And then we create dataset.spell. And then that's going to look like data-spell invisibility. And dataset.components is going to be the data-components, moonlight, shadow essence. And then we have the text content, ancient spell scroll. And then we append it to the playground. So the data set is basically a convenient way to work with data attributes. So we could have actually just put all this right into our HTML, and then we could still access the data attributes, but I'm just showing how you can actually create it right within JavaScript. So let's look at how to access the data. So if I save this, we can see console.log spell type secret scroll.dataset.spell, and then we can see the spell type is invisibility. Secret set.dataset.components, and we're splitting it at the comma. So then we are creating an array with moonlight and shadow essence. Now, one thing to note, if we do spell type, and we call it spell type like this, now if we look back at the elements of what it looks like in the HTML, we'll see it's data-spell-type. So the attribute names are automatically going to be converted between this dash, spell dash type, but then when you access it in JavaScript, you're going to use the camel case. So these data attributes are really useful for a few different reasons. They allow you to store custom data directly in your HTML elements, which can be accessed with JavaScript. They don't interfere with the standard HTML attributes, so you can use them freely without worrying about conflicts. Also, they're ignored by CSS, so they won't affect the styling of your elements. And they're a valid way to store data according to the HTML5 specification, which makes them a clean and standards compliant solution. Now let's talk about manipulating classes. Classes are often used for styling elements with CSS, but they're also useful for JavaScript selection and manipulation. The class list object is a convenient way to work with an element's classes. So here we're creating a new element, then we're setting the text content, we're appending it to the playground, and then we're using ClassList.add to add two classes to the element. This method can take multiple class names as arguments. So let's look at what the HTML looks like. So if we look into this div class, magical, it now has the classes magical and creature. Now let's remove those classes. So we can do shapeshifter.classlist.remove, and then we can just pass in one of the classes, creature, and then we can add one, shapeshifter.classlist.add humanoid. And if I save that, we can now see that's magical humanoid. Also, if we go to the console, we can see the initial class is magical creature, and then let's log the updated classes, and we can see updated classes magical humanoid. We can also toggle a class, and you can see now we're console.log if the class list contains invisible, it says true. And then we can also see invisible here. And if we toggle it 2 times, we can see, oh, it does not contain it. So, and it's false. So toggle just does either add or remove, whatever the opposite of what is already true. So here's a few other interesting things. We can toggle invisible, and this is going to, it's a second argument that can either be true to force adding it or false to force removing the class. And so since this is going to be random here, there's a 50% chance of whether it's going to be invisible. And then we can also replace a class with another class, and then we can console.log the third class if it exists. So let me just save this. And so it's third class invisible. But if I do this a few times, now it says third class null, because this time, because of the randomness, it was not added. So the class list object is useful for dynamic manipulation of an element's classes. It's more convenient and less error prone than using the class name property directly, especially when you need to add or remove individual classes without affecting the others. Now let's talk about inline styles. It's generally better to use CSS classes for styling, but sometimes you need to apply styles directly to an element. So that's where inline styles become helpful. So here we're going to create the div element, we're going to set the text element, the text content to a diamond, and then we can do style.font-size equals 50 pixels, style.transition equals all for 2 seconds, and then we append the gem. And then we can see the style right in the HTML down here. Now note that we use this camel case font size, but then it uses the dash here when it puts it in the style right here, font dash size. Now we can animate the gem. So let me just add a little bit more code here, and I'll save it. Now, you see it's like going around in a circle here. So basically this is going to use the set interval to change the rotation and the color of our gem every 2 seconds, which is this demonstrates how you can use JavaScript to dynamically update style based on conditions over time. The style property of an element gives you direct access to its inline styles. So each CSS property becomes a property of the style object, which allows for very fine-grained control over an element's appearance. Inline styles are useful for dynamic JavaScript-driven style changes, but it's generally best to use CSS classes for most styling purposes. Event handling. Event handling is crucial for creating interactive web pages. It allows you to respond to user actions and other occurrences in the browser. So here's how to add an event listener to an element. So we just create the element like normal with the text content, and then we append the magic button, which is an element of type button, and then we're going to add event listener, magic button.add event listener. And this is going to have 2 main arguments. The first is the type of event to listen for. In this case, click, but it could also be mouse over, key down, and a few other things. And then you also pass in the function that's going to run when the event occurs. This is often called the event handler or the callback function. So if I click this button here, we're going to get the alert. Magic sparkles fills the air. So some of the other events you could listen for are like click, double click, mouse enter, mouse leave, mouse move. We have key up, key down, key press. We have form events like submit, change, input, focus, blur. We have window events like load, resize, scroll, and unload. So there's a lot of different events you can listen for. So here's a few other event listeners that we've added on the magic button. So one for mouse over, it's going to change event.target.style.background color to purple. Or we event.target.style that background color to nothing. So let's see what happens when we do that. If we mouse over the button, it's going to turn purple when we go over it and not be purple when we go off. The event object, which is in this case event, this is going to provide information about the event, including which element triggered it. So event.target is going to be the element that triggered it. Then we can do that .style.background color. We could also remove listeners when they're no longer needed. So let me show you how that would look. So let's say instead of putting the callback function right within here, we're going to have the function separate. So this function is spellcast, and we can add the event listener. But then later, if we no longer need it, we can remove event listener. Right now, since they're both here, it's going to add it and remove it really quick. So if we click the button, nothing's going to happen. But if we had not removed the event listener, then when we click the button, it will actually do the pop-up. Note that to remove an event listener, you need to provide the same function that was originally added. This is why it's often useful to use named functions instead of anonymous functions for event listeners if you plan to remove them later. Event handling is a vast topic in JavaScript, and there's a lot more to learn that we're not going to cover in this video, such as event bubbling and capturing, preventing default behaviors, event delegation for efficiently handling events on multiple elements, and custom events. Now let's talk about creating and removing elements dynamically. Dynamic creation and removal of elements is a powerful feature that allows you to update your web page's content based on user interactions or data changes. So let's look at what we have so far. So we create a UL element, an unordered list. We append the element, but right now there's nothing in the element. You can see in the HTML over here, but there's a function that hasn't been called yet. But let's see what happens. This function is going to take a spell name. It's going to create an li element, a list element, and then it's going to set the text content to the spell name. Then it's going to create a a button that's going to be called remove button with the text content of remove. It's going to add an event listener to that button, which is going to do spell.remove. And now this is going to only apply to this particular list element. And it's going to append the remove button to the spell. And then it's going to append the spell to the spell list. That's the unordered list. So basically, it's a way to dynamically add elements to the list. So I'm going to add 2 more lines of code down here. Add spell fireball, add spell frost nova, and if I save this, okay, we can see what happened. We have the 2 spells here with a remove button, and if we look at the HTML here, we can see the fireball with the remove button, we see the frost nova with the remove button, and we can call this function as many times as we want to add as many spells as we want. And if we click the remove button, it automatically removes that element, and you can see it's now no longer in the HTML here. And the remove button is tied to that specific element in the way that we made it in the code here. This technique is particularly useful for things like creating dynamic lists or tables based on data, or adding new form fields on user requests, or implementing to-do lists or shopping carts or anything like that. Let's talk about DOM traversal. This is all about navigating through the DOM, which is really important for many JavaScript operations. The DOM provides several properties for traversing between related nodes. So we created some nodes. We created a div element, a p element, a span element, then we appended these, and then we put everything on the playground. So if we look here, we have this div, that's the parent element, and the child elements are the paragraph tag and the span here. So now let's traverse the DOM. I'm going to put in some more code here where we're going to just console.log some things. So if I go into the console, we can see that the first child is the p element because that was added first to this parent element. The last child is the span element because that was added last to that parent element. We also have child element 1.next sibling. What comes after that child element? Well, it's child element 2, which is the span. And then we have child element 2, which is the span previous sibling. Well, that's going to be child element 1, which is the paragraph tag. And then we can also get the parent node of child element 1, which is, if you see here, that's the entire div with the paragraph and the span here. So these are ways to access different elements within the DOM. This is going to be useful when you want to find related elements without knowing their IDs or classes, or you want to create complex DOM manipulations that depend on element relationships. It also allows you to implement features like expanding or collapsing nested lists or tree structures. Document fragments are lightweight containers for holding multiple elements before adding them to the DOM. They're useful for improving performance when you need to add many elements at once. So here I've created a document fragment. It's not going to show up anywhere because we haven't added it to the DOM. But now let's add some elements to our fragment. So I'm just going to paste in this code here. We're going to use a loop. It's going to create a list item. It's going to do magical item, and then it's going to do a number, which is going to correspond to the number in our loop, and then we're going to add all these list items to our fragment. Now, if we have list items, we're going to need an unordered list. So we add this unordered list to the playground, but it still does not have the fragment added. So we're going to do spell list.append, and we're going to append the fragment. So if we save this, now we can see these magical items. And if we look in here, we can see the unordered list, and then we have the different list items. So that all got added from our fragment here. Now you could also rearrange this code to maybe make it more readable, like maybe you want to create the spell list up here. You may want to append the spell list before you create the fragment. But I just want to show you that the order doesn't really matter as long as you have the fragment. It doesn't have to connect to anything until you're ready. And one good thing about making fragments is that a document fragment is not part of the active DOM tree. So appending elements to it doesn't cause page reflow. This can significantly improve performance when adding many elements at once. So when you build document fragments, it can improve the performance for batch inserts, and it can reduce the number of reflows and repairs. and it's just cleaner code when you're working with multiple elements. Now let's talk about using templates. HTML templates are powerful for creating reusable content. So I've added this template to the HTML IDE wizard template. It has this div with class wizard, h2 class wizard name, paragraph wizard specialty. So we're going to use this template in our JavaScript. So let's go over to our JavaScript here, and we're going to get access to our wizard template. And now we have this function. We haven't called it yet, but create wizard. We have a name, specialty that gets passed in. So we get the wizard element template. That's this template here. .content clone node. So it's going to basically clone this template, and then we have our query selector wizard name, and then we're going to set the text content to the name that was passed in, and then the wizard specialty, we're going to set the text content to the specialty, and then we're going to append that wizard element to the playground. So we're all doing this based on the template. We don't have to create all these elements because they already exist when we clone that node, and then we just have to select the different elements. So let's use that. I will create Wizard Merlin with Time Magic, Gandalf with Fireworks. So now we have Merlin, Time Magic, Gandalf, Fireworks, and we can see here in the HTML, we have H2 wizard name Merlin, paragraph tag, wizard specialty, Time Magic, and then we have another wizard here, wizard name Gandalf with wizard specialty, Fireworks. Templates allow you to define a structure once and use it multiple times. The content of a template is not rendered until it's cloned and added to the document. So some benefits of using templates are the reusability. You can define complex structures once and reuse them. Also performance. Cloning a template is often faster than creating elements from scratch. And then you have a separation of concerns. You keep your HTML structure separate from your JavaScript logic. Thanks for watching, and remember, use your code for good.